elections are a fundamental requirement for democratic development. Through elections, citizens exercise choice from competing party platforms and candidates. They choose those to represent them in the legislature. They fill elective positions in the executive branches, and quite often, even in the judicial branches of government. For elections to be meaningful, democratic, and beneficial to citizens, they should have integrity. And that's why there is a lot of talk in the literature about electoral integrity. That means they have to be rule-based, they need to be transparent, they need to be free and fair in courts, and they need to have a level playing field for all participating political parties and candidates. Similarly, their preparation and conduct must be seen to be professional, efficient, non-partisan, and impartial. Now, campaigns are very important aspects of elections. Indeed, election campaigns play a significant role in deepening democracy, especially in countries such as ours that are called or referred to as developing democracies. Through election campaigns, parties and candidates advertise themselves and their ideas and their positions to the electorate so that they can be chosen and elected by the electorate from an array of competing parties and candidates. But like all aspects of elections, campaigns are also essentially rule-based. Their period and duration are defined by either the provisions of the constitutions and/or especially by acts of the legislature. And they are also regulated by election management bodies. Thus, in virtually all electoral jurisdictions, the period for commencement and end of campaigns are specified. Sanctions are often provided for violations. The applications of sanctions, however, differs from one electoral jurisdiction to another. In general, the more carefully and unambiguously defined and strictly applied the sanctions are, the greater the deterrence against violations by parties and candidates. Conversely, the more vaguely defined, if at all, and poorly sanctioned, the more likely the violations by political parties and candidates. Hence, effective sanctioning is essentially the panacea for addressing the challenges of all election campaigns, especially premature election campaigns. Premature election campaigns are undesirable aberrations in democratic elections, posing serious challenges to the integrity of elections. If not properly checked, they pose one of the most serious threats to elections, and they undermine the integrity of the entire electoral process. Premature election campaigns are basically campaigns done outside the legally defined period. They create an uneven playing field for parties, for candidates, even for their supporters. They bring disrespect and they violate the electoral law. They confer unfair advantages to parties and candidates who jump the gun. They breach or entrench a culture of lawlessness and impunity, and they create political tensions that may even result in conflicts and the undermining of law and order in an electoral jurisdiction. To protect the integrity of the electoral process, therefore, most electoral systems require campaigns to be conducted according to the rules and regulations provided in the electoral legal framework, with due respect given to the calendar of the elections, respecting the right and freedoms of other parties to organize and campaign and reach out to voters, respecting election managers and not interfering with the performance of their duties, and using official complaint process and the legal systems for appeals. Now, although the Nigerian electoral legal framework contains some provisions regulating election campaigns, as it provides for period of commencement and end of campaigns, regrettably, premature campaigning has remained inadequately regulated and has become increasingly widespread, characterized mainly by the display of posters or billboards featuring politicians across political parties, but especially of incumbents at both federal and state levels. These are literally jumping the gun at least 2 years before the campaign period as defined in the legal framework. Many, if not most of these, are what can be termed as third-party campaigns, ostensibly carried out by candidates' support groups with dubious financing, most likely in crass valuation of campaign financing legislations. There are allegations, in fact, that some parties or candidates sponsor these pre-campaigns, hiding behind dubious illegal third parties, thereby also breaching campaign finance laws. Premature campaigns consist of not only erection of billboards with candidates' portraits and messages soliciting votes and/or endorsements, but they also include using public media and resources to advertise records of so-called achievements of incumbents or use of official positions and commissioning of projects for electioneering purposes. When incumbents do it and get away with it, or other third parties do it on their behalf and get away with it, obviously a spiral of illegalities and lawlessness is unfolded, undermining the rule-based system and, of course, the integrity of the electoral process. There is no doubt that currently in Nigeria, the prevalence of premature campaigns raises serious challenges to the preparations and conduct of the 2007 elections, and therefore need to be sanitized urgently. It is being done quite brazenly, especially by incumbent elected officials at all levels and tiers of government. In fact, when you reflect deeply on this, one is tempted to say that premature election campaigns are actually being perpetrated by premature Democrats and politicians. Because anybody who understands what democracy should mean to the ordinary people in terms of governance, and also understands why it is important to do elections on a level playing field, would not recklessly undermine clear legal provisions and conduct these premature campaigns. So one cannot resist the temptation to say that many of our politicians, frankly, are not only lawless and reckless, but they also do not even understand the basic democratic principles which should undergird their participation in elections and their participation in governance. So we have quite a lot to do. Aside from, of course, improving the legal framework and also ensuring that there is compliance and there are sanctions for those who refuse to comply, there is also need for a lot of voter education and sensitization for citizens to understand the negative impact and consequences on premature campaigns. The Nigerian Constitution, as amended, is comparatively silent on the issue of election campaigns and related matters. But on monitoring of political parties in Nigeria, Section 83(2) of the Electoral Act 2022 states that the Commission, meaning INEC, may seek information or clarification from any registered political party in connection with any activities of the political party that may be contrary to the provisions of the Constitution or any other law, guidelines, rules, or regulations made pursuant to an act of the National Assembly. Furthermore, and this was mentioned by both the chairman and another contributor, Section 94, subsection 1, states that for the purpose of this act, the period of campaigning in public by every political party shall commence 150 days before polling day and end 24 hours prior to that day. While Section 95, subsection 1 states that, and I quote, a candidate and his or her party shall campaign for elections in accordance with such rules and regulations as may be determined by the Commission. And I think it's very important to reiterate this, which means that if there is a lacuna in the Electoral Act, the Commission is actually empowered to make laws, rules and regulations that can guide campaign and elections. I will come back to this point later. From these provisions, it is clear that jumping the gun is prohibited, and it would also seem that the onus of regulating and sanctioning campaigns is placed on INEC. The pertinent questions, therefore, are, is there a clear, unambiguous definition of what constitutes election campaign by INEC? What guidelines and rules has INEC determined and put in place for the regulation of election campaigns, especially the premature third-party campaigns? And how robust are these? What gaps need to be addressed in good time before the 2027 elections? And to my mind, these are questions that really need to be interrogated in the round table we are going to have today. But let me briefly speak about what I call issues associated with premature campaigns in Nigeria. The Electoral Act provides a specific timeline, as many of us have mentioned, for the start of campaigns. Any form of premature campaigning violates this provision, undermining INEC's authority and the electoral legal framework. Its consequences are enormous on Nigeria's electoral processes and democratic development, such as broadly undermining democratic institutions, encouraging lawlessness among the political actors, and granting unfair political advantage to parties and candidates who are reckless and brazen in disrespecting the law. Candidates or parties who begin campaigning early often gain visibility and influence than other candidates. This creates an uneven playing field. It also reduces political competition, and ultimately it escalates campaign spending, which, as the chairman mentioned, will now be difficult to trace under the campaign financing law. Similarly, premature campaigns shift focus from governance to politics, especially when incumbents engage in early campaigning and divert attention to politicking rather than fulfilling their mandate to the electorate. Indeed, in the Nigerian context, premature campaigns quite often heat up the polity, increase political rivalry, as well as engenders hate speech and ethno-religious polarization. This often triggers violence, especially in politically volatile areas, deters peaceful political participation, and weakens the enforcement mechanism to punish the offenders. There are so many ways politicians exploit legal loopholes to engage in premature campaigns, such as consultative meetings, so-called consultative meetings, project commissioning, ceremonial events, and distribution of so-called palliatives. In fact, they spend less time in governance, and therefore they do less and less projects and have less and less palliatives to give, so they spend actually more time on these side events rather than on the main focus of governance for democratic development and meeting or satisfying the needs and aspirations of citizens. To protect the integrity of the electoral process and to nurture and enhance perception of impartiality and neutrality of the election management bodies, many electoral jurisdictions not only clearly define what premature campaigns in the electoral are in the electoral legal framework and provide sections for them, they also strive to strictly penalize the crass manifestations of these, with penalties ranging from fines to imprisonment. Examples of countries where noteworthy efforts are made are Australia, Mexico, Philippines, and to some extent, India. I regret to say that I am not comfortable about mentioning any African country where serious efforts have been made, to checkmate premature campaigns. Some are doing it, but frankly, most are below standard. It can be said that in the Nigerian case, certainly much needs to be desired, both in terms of explicitly defining premature elections in the legal framework, providing for stiff sanctions for them, and in strictly imposing the provided sanctions. Nigeria can benefit from how election campaigns are regulated and sanctions from other countries, especially those that I have mentioned, and we need to cast our net wide in order to draw appropriate lessons as we strive to improve our own legal framework for regulating election campaign, premature election campaigns. In this regard, I have ventured to make a few recommendations. First of all, I think that all election campaign offenses, and especially premature offenses, should be carefully defined with stiff penalties, specified, and strict enforcement where applicable. Obviously, there has to be what I call an alliance of stakeholders for credible elections to help drive this process in the legislature. I'm sorry, Honorable, or is not here, but many of the members in the National Assembly, where you will expect the legislations to be made, are actually beneficiaries of these challenges. And on their own, they are very unlikely to drive reforms that can remove these benefits from them. So really a strong alliance of stakeholders for improving the credibility of elections generally, but for addressing these specific issues and challenges is highly necessary. The Nigerian civil society has been quite vibrant, but it needs to expand the scope and to identify priorities, not carry all issues. Identify priorities and certainly addressing premature campaign premature campaigns more specifically, and generally all campaign matters, to my mind, is a priority, and this should be addressed. And a lot can be done if we have such a strong, forceful, focused grouping of stakeholders that can engage the National Assembly and ensure that they drive these processes of reforms. It is the easy excuse to say that these campaigns, although they are for me, are done by others whom I have no control over. And it is very, very important to find ways and means, because once you can say parties and candidates are vicariously responsible for third-party campaigners for them, obviously they will have to take measures to ensure that they do not violate the law. It may sound easier said than done, yes, but serious solutions also require serious efforts. So I consider it something worthy of exploring. Thirdly, EFCC and ICPC should pay special attention to third-party campaigners and thoroughly interrogate their sources of funding. I say this because the chairman himself mentioned, because the period of elections is defined in the legal framework, so perhaps there is hesitation on the part of the Electoral Commission to go beyond that period and start looking at the finances of these third-party candidates. So obviously, we have to find ways and means as part of their responsibilities for them to now pay special attention to this. I'm aware that there is a relatively robust working relationship with the Commission under the Security Access Committee, and I'm sure methodologies and frameworks can be created as to how this can be done. 4, in determining whether candidates and parties' expenditures fall within approved limits, the estimated determined expenditure by a third-party campaigner for the candidate or party should also be taken into consideration. The EMBs, and because we're in a federal system, when I talk of EMBs, I refer to INEC as well as the CX, even though we all know the terrible challenges that fears face. But we must bring them in, hopefully, to have some reform processes also impacting them. So the EMBs must be made to work closely and collaboratively to ensure appropriate imposition of sanctions and penalties where appropriate. And lastly, the recommendation for the establishment of Elections Offences Commission and Tribunal has become even more urgent and important for serious consideration, and it should be addressed in the current round of electoral reforms before the 2027 elections. Because the more you say EMBs or INEC should do this, should do this, should do this, many of us believe that INEC is already overburdened. So if we really want successful, impactful reform process addressing some of these challenges, we must also look for ways to reduce the burden on INEC, where other actors can come into the field, whether a coalition of civil society organizations or the EFCC and the ICPC, and so on and so forth.